Good evening and welcome to the Newshour Agenda. I'm Madhavdas G. Viewers, amidst 3 years of ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, all eyes are on the Trump-Zelensky meeting in the White House tomorrow. Even ahead of the meeting, Trump appears to have ruled out any prospects of Ukraine getting NATO membership, as he asserted that Kyiv could forget about joining the security bloc. Trump also added that it was probably the reason the whole thing started in the first place. Listen in to the US president.
Oh, I don't want to start right now, but I can tell you that NATO you can forget about. I think that's probably the reason the whole thing started.
The US has also claimed that the upcoming deal with Ukraine would give the US access to Ukraine's deposits of rare earth minerals. While US eyes Ukrainian minerals, Zelensky insists on guarantees ahead of the Trump meeting, aiming to crush the Russian aggression. On the other hand, Putin has hailed the start of a renewed dialogue with US and said that the administration of President Donald Trump showed a pragmatism and realistic view. Let's listen in.
Ще один пункт, на який би я звернув увагу, безумовно, це про економіку договір, але я дуже просив, щоб з'явилось хоча б розуміння, що ми однаково бачимо, що все це є частиною майбутніх гарантій безпеки. І тому навіть в рамковій угоді я дуже хотів, щоб з'явилось хоча б речення гарантії безпеки України.
Важно, что наши сегодняшние партнеры демонстрируют прагматизм, реальный взгляд на вещи. Отказываются от многих стереотипов, так называемых правил и мессианских идеологических клише своих предшественников, которые, собственно, и привели к кризису всей системы международных отношений.
Viewers, let's take you across what's really at stake as far as US, EU, as well as, of course, Russia, as far as this is concerned. Let's take a look at what it means for the United States. European nations may seek alternative security arrangements. That's one aspect of it, given the fact that they're part of NATO. US could also lose its geopolitical significance in the entire European region. Ukraine's sovereignty is compromised is, of course, something that could happen if, of course, NATO collapses in this sense. And also, of course, southern parts of Ukraine could be annexed by Russia if at all this really happens on ground. Donbass, rich in minerals, are likely to be annexed or could possibly be annexed is one aspect. Let's take a look at what this would mean if the NATO collapses as far as EU is concerned. Now, there will be no NATO if the US withdraws its support, as of course what we're discussing. More than 1 lakh US personnel stationed in Europe in different parts. Also, of course, going ahead for EU, they will not be able to depend on US support for its defense as they traditionally have been for decades now. And that's as far as EU is concerned. And more nations could be vulnerable if there potentially is a threat from Russia in the future as well, is one aspect that we're looking at. Let's take a quick look also at what this really means. If we can bring in the next slide in terms of the impact of this particular aspect. If we can quickly ask the production team to get us the next frame on this as well, in terms of implications as well. All right. Let's quickly go across, in fact, to Jessica Stone, who's a Voice of America correspondent. Jessica, let me come across to you first on the meeting with Keir Starmer that is likely to take place in a short while from now at the White House. But the big, of course, meeting tomorrow is going to have its shadow over this one as well, where there are certain security concessions and guarantees that the UK will be trying to extract from President Trump. Now, President Macron's not been successful earlier this week. What's the likelihood that one of US's closest allies, the UK, will be successful in this regard? Jessica.
Well, Starmer's coming to the White House already having made a concession himself. He announced on Tuesday that the UK is going to increase its budget to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and 2.6% by 2028, also promising that he'll have the parliament look at this issue again in 2029, and that they will attempt to, or that he will support increasing defense spending by an additional 3% or up to 3%. Analysts say that he's going to be pushing for the EU really to be part of the Ukraine talks. That's going to be his main focus, as well as what a peacekeeping force would look like. Of course, earlier this week, Macron has proposed that EU peacekeepers take the bulk of the responsibility, but that the U.S. performs some sort of backstop. We don't know what that's going to look like yet. And of course, there's going to be negotiations today and tomorrow between these two parties that could definitely impact what the outcome looks like. It's not really sure whether the EU is going to accept what Macron has proposed or what might come out of today. And of course, that has to go through their decision-making process. But the bottom line, analysts say, is if Trump and Starmer can get along, it's going to make cooperation much more likely. Remember, this is a really personal approach for President Trump.
Okay. And also, you know, the big one tomorrow is the Zelensky bilateral. And of course, there are strong positions that have been taken by President Trump and President Zelensky, whether we're talking about, Ukraine's membership of NATO, minerals and other aspects. Is this visit likely to see a big deal being signed that many believe could potentially pave the way for peace in Europe?
I don't think that we're going to see a peace deal signed tomorrow. I think that the best case scenario is that we see some sort of deal that creates more economic interdependence between the U.S. and Kyiv on the table. We do know there's going to be a press conference tomorrow, and so that does indicate that there'll be an opportunity to explain something, hopefully sign something. We're not seeing evidence of a signing ceremony yet, but the White House has really been talking up the idea that there will be an economic interdependence, that this critical minerals deal could look like a 50-50 split between the profits, and that it'll go back into recouping some of the costs that the U.S. has put into the Ukraine war.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us, Jessica, with that update. We'll come back to you tomorrow as well for more updates from that big meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. Thanks so much for joining us indeed. Let's open this up and take it across to our guest. Joining us with us at the moment is Peter Kuznick, who's an author. He's also a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute of the American University. Joining us is Alexander Khara, former Ukrainian diplomat. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. Mr. Khara, let me begin with you. What are your expectations from the meeting that is to take place tomorrow? Are we looking at, the first step in the roadmap to peace, with the economic interdependence between Ukraine and US being firmly established? What are your expectations?
Well, unfortunately, it's not a step towards the peace because Russia believes it may outmaneuver Ukraine politically, diplomatically with the United States, that is willing to give up on Ukraine and to withdraw from Europe, rather than on the battlefield. The Russians are not very successful at the moment, even though they are advancing just a bit, but the amount of casualties is just staggering. So this visit is so important for Ukraine because we are trying to calm down the calm down the rhetoric from both sides. We want to have this interdependence, economic interdependence, and we want to negotiate with American side a sort of agreement on the future security of Ukraine, because there is no reason for Ukraine to agree on ceasefire or peace with Russia if we don't have any security guarantees, which Russia would use to attack us again and again.
Okay. Also joining us on the panel is Nikita Menkovich, who's the director of the Eurasian Analytical Club from Moscow. Sushant Sareen, who's senior fellow of ORF, is with us from New Delhi. But let me put this question that you've raised to Peter Kuznick. Peter Kuznick, with the absence of security guarantees, who's to say what can happen tomorrow and whether Russia can open up another front or launch another attack on us? And that's why that security guarantee, Ukraine says, is so essential to ensure peace in the future. Your response?
Certainly understandable from a Ukrainian perspective why they want security guarantees, especially with Donald Trump in the White House, beginning with his phone call with Putin and then the meeting in Riyadh, and now the meeting that's taking place in Istanbul. There is no reason why the Ukrainians should trust Donald Trump or the United States or the Europeans for that matter. But Trump has from the beginning insisted that he's going to bring peace to Ukraine. He said within the first 24 hours, well, that didn't happen. First 24 days, that hasn't happened. But we're moving closer now toward the possibility of peace negotiations than we've seen for the last 3 years, or at least since March of 2022. So that's, I think, a positive step in the right direction. But if I were Ukraine, I certainly wouldn't trust the United States. Hegseth, Vance, and Trump have all made clear that the United States is not going to provide security guarantees.
Okay.
He says it's all on Europe, and if the Europeans form a peacekeeping force of some sort, the United States is not going to have their back.
Okay,
So
let me bring in
why...
Nikita on that. Nikita Benkovich, if you can come in on that, what is your perspective? Because Ukraine says we can't trust Russia in terms of what they've done in the past, and who knows what they're going to do in the future. And therefore, without this security guarantee, peace is going to be a non-starter. How do you respond to that?
First of all, there is no Ukraine side in these negotiations. Mr. Zelensky is just Trump American agent, nothing more. He does not represent Ukrainian people at all. Watching the negotiations between Zelensky and Trump, we are watching the story about one thief robbed another. You see, Mr. Trump said, I give you plenty of money to conquer this country, to conquer these people for me, and where is my money? Mr. Zelensky said, I did my best. Now I want guarantees that I wouldn't be arrested and judged by Ukrainian people for being a traitor. It is a story about two thieves. What kind of guarantee could one give to another? The only option in this situation not to deal with the criminals. You can't get any kind of guarantee.
You're right. The criminal is Mr. Putin.
To kill your neighbor.
Okay. Just coming to gentlemen. Just one second. Let me just come in.
You should not kill your neighbor.
Yeah. I'm going to bring you both back into the debate, but I want to just bring in Sushant Sareen for a moment. Sushant, this is typical of the transactional nature of President Trump, is what many believe. Even the announcement tomorrow is expected to be in the form of a deal, and he's been a businessman. He's used to announcing deals. He sees this as some kind of way in securing US's economic interest for the money that's been spent in the past, also proving a political point in the bargain. But what does all of this really mean for India and also the globe at large? Because if he's going to leave, Europe to its own devices, and we've seen what Vance has said in Europe in the recent past, what does that really mean for NATO? Are we looking at the NATO collapsing? What really is on the cards?
Well, I think the NATO arrangement has kind of come quite unstuck, and quite clearly they'll have to rethink how they're going to rejig this whole NATO arrangement, because once the Americans walk out, what is left in NATO? The Europeans have dulled themselves and beguiled themselves into not even being credible military powers anymore. And I don't think anybody really takes them seriously. So that is one part of it. The second part of it is, there's a lot of talk about security guarantees right now. Even if the Americans were to offer security guarantees, they're worth nothing to nobody. The only security guarantee that a country has is its own strength. Okay, there is nothing more, there's no other guarantee which works more than that. And this is something, when you ask Madhav, what does it mean for India? What it means for India is that India has to ensure that if our friends come to our assistance, if required, well and good, but we are not going to depend on anybody coming to our assistance to protect ourselves and to guarantee our own security, whether it means, going in with non-conventional weapons like the nuclear weapons, whether it means missile systems, whatever else. This whole concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat, this is what our security guarantee is. And finally, on the Trump.
Yeah, and we have in fact broken down some of those points diplomatically speaking. Let's quickly take a look at those graphics. What it means for India is a tightrope for India to walk on diplomatically speaking. A US-Ukraine deal with Russia's acceptance could also tilt the global power balance. So what it really means in that sense remains to be seen. And also, of course, in terms of India's own dealing, given the fact that we've taken a very independent line vis-a-vis Russia, of course, is something that remains to be seen. All right. So this is, in fact, what we're talking about in terms of India's and the importance of this for India itself. Let me go right back to Peter Kuznick. Peter Kuznick, what are we looking at? Is this the collapse of NATO? And are we looking at, Europe having to defend itself? And if there is, the continued fighting in Ukraine, given what President Trump has said, will it be up to EU to now defend Ukraine or arm Ukraine as the position may arise in the future? Peter.
Well, that's what Trump is saying, that Europe should come to Ukraine's defense. Europe should take the responsibility. Europe should supply the security guarantees for Ukraine, and Europe should take responsibility for financing the continued war.
The Europeans are not in a position to do that. And they have said that even though they support a peacekeeping force, that unless the United States provides backup, then they're not even going to risk that. And so Ukraine is in a very, very difficult position, which is why it behooves everybody to move as quickly for a settlement that reflects everybody's long-term interests. What everybody says is they don't want a short-term peace. They don't want a ceasefire. They want a long-term peace. Well, a long-term peace has to reflect Russia's interests. It has to reflect Ukraine's interests, has to reflect Europe's interests and the U.S. interests, and that is possible. But they've got to sit down and start talking. And that's the one good thing that's come of the Trump presidency so far, is that we're closer to talk and negotiations. It's not clear what the terms of that are, but we're not going to figure that out until we sit down at the table. What's going on now is a disaster for the Ukrainians, for the Russians, for the economically, but mostly in terms of the human cost of this war has been devastating. So if we can sit down, India has played a positive role,
right?
And China and Brazil have played a positive role, but we need to sit down and start talking as quickly as possible.
Right. Let me bring in fact, Alexander Kara on that. Alexander Kara, the point that many are making is that there has to be a breakthrough. And the status quo as it is, I mean, the endless war, many are saying that 3 years of fighting, is Trump, in a sense, completely wrong? Because what he says is that if he says we can't support you with arms, it's also the fact that globally, and India is, in fact, one of the countries that's come out to say that now is not the time for war. There has to be an end in sight. It cannot be an endless, protracted war and fighting. There has to be a solution found. Alexander Kara?
Well, if your neighbor has nuclear arms and has a genocidal intent and conducts this war in genocidal style, you have no other option but to fight back. May I remind you that back in 2022, the only Western weapons that we had were javelins and stingers, and we fought with Soviet and Ukrainian arms. And after we showed our willingness to defend ourselves and our sovereignty, our Western partners came to assist us. So it's not time for peace for a simple reason, because this war is not just about Ukraine. Russia wants to impose spheres of influence not just in Ukraine or those countries that are not lucky to be members of NATO and EU, but the Central and Eastern European countries, which is not acceptable. And Russia has some interests in other regions, like in the Middle East and elsewhere. So I don't think that there is a possibility for Trump to negotiate peace, given this appetite from Moscow.
Okay. Nikita, I want you to come in on this because, it's a fact that Trump has drastically changed the position of the United States. We've seen the United States voting with Russia and what many would have perhaps believed to be impossible alongside, countries such as Belarus and North Korea when it came to various resolutions in the United Nations. The big point is that with that change in stance, is that not enough for Russia to also perhaps come forward and, perhaps look at possible solutions, diplomatically speaking, when it comes to what's happening and the negotiations between US and Ukraine?
Going back to the question of the guarantees for Ukrainian people, the best one is to arrest Mr. Zelensky and give it to Moscow, to isolate him and to secure Ukrainian population from this regime. I understand that it is funny for Mr.
Nikita, let's be fair. If he was the kind of war criminal that you're claiming, why would Mr. Trump be entertaining him? At the end of the day, there may not have been elections, and you're right, perhaps to that extent. But the point is, he is at the moment the head of Ukraine.
Director, Mr. Kash Patel informed that Mr. Zelensky is under investigation for taking part in the murder of American journalist Lira. He was killed by Ukrainian regime 2 years ago.
How many
Mr. Zelensky is just a usual criminal who was hired by Trump to conquer Russia and Ukrainian people. He failed. That's all the story.
Well, understandably, very, very different positions from Russia and Ukraine here. But, Sushant, two very quick questions. One of the implications that we're talking about is also that if this happens, if the US completely exits from Europe, and there's a significant presence of US there in Europe, about over a lakh of their troops that are present there, are we looking at Russia and China getting emboldened? Because that could have its own implications as far as India and Asia Pacific is concerned. And also, at a time when Trump is talking tariffs to EU, you have the EU president over here, Ursula von der Leyen. Is there something that India can do to perhaps leverage the situation in that sense?
Look, I think there are a couple of things involved out here. One, the transatlantic relationship is certainly coming under strain. Look, the Europeans actually kowtowed to the Americans simply because the Americans were paying their bills, at least insofar as security and other things were concerned. Now, if the Americans are going to ask the Europeans to pay their bills and the Americans are going to, burn up the entire transatlantic trade relationship, then obviously the Europeans will look for other alternatives. Now, do we find space in this new jostling which is going to be taking place? Perhaps there is some space for us, but there will also be pressures on us. On the other front, I think some of the calculation is that the moment the Americans are able to rid themselves of their obsession in Europe and trying to defend this whole European theater out there, they can focus more on the Indo-Pacific. Will they actually focus on the Indo-Pacific? I think that's $1 billion question now as far as India is concerned. And there is an assumption that once America and the Russians can have some kind of a relationship going, some degree of normalization, then perhaps there could be some space that could come. And maybe this is expecting too much, but between the Russians and the Chinese. So I think there are a lot of balls in the air right now. Nobody really knows how it's going to unfold. Extreme amount of uncertainty on what the new global systems and the new global order is going to be. But at least one thing we can be sure of, Madhav, at least whether you like it or not, the stalemate which was there in the war in Ukraine is being broken. Right. Will this lead to a long-term deal? I don't think so. We've seen parts of it in your studio, the diametrically opposite views of the Ukrainians and the Russians, number one. Absolutely. But even more important, the Ukrainians settle down to the Russians gobbling up 25% of their territory. How will that go down? I don't see any solution on the border issue anytime soon.
Well, a very challenging issue indeed, and perhaps one of the most vexing of our times. I'd like to thank all our panelists for joining us. Sushant Sareen, Peter Kuznick, Nikita Mendovich, Alexander Khara. All eyes will be on whether there can be a resolution, certainly far more complicated than the conflict between Israel and Hamas, given the reasons that Sushant was just describing. But will tomorrow's meeting be the first step in the road to peace? That's a question that's on the minds of many at the moment. Thanks so much for joining us indeed.